George Pickens is not hiding his frustrations. He's addressing them. He's addressing the issues. And at this point, even if it's not perfect, and yeah, there are some things that he's definitely doing wrong, if you blame him, if you're sitting around trying to come up with every excuse why he is the problem, you're not paying attention to why he's upset. What's going on, everybody? I'm Noah Strackbine. Thank you for jumping on to Steelers To Go, your daily to-go cup of Pittsburgh Steelers news and analysis. Find us on youtube.com/allsteelerstalkers. Subscribe anywhere you get your podcast. The Pittsburgh Steelers, they prepare for the Indianapolis Colts, and all week long, the conversation has been around one thing and one thing only, and that is the culture within the Steelers locker room. Is it dead? Is the Steelers way over? Every voice from every angle, former player, current analyst, podcast hosts, everybody is talking about the Steelers way, whether or not it's still around. And in the midst of this, the wide receivers have been under a bit of attack. Everybody's been under attack. Nobody's been shy about who's to blame for these issues. And while George Pickens and Deontay Johnson are not getting all of the blame and nowhere near as much blame as somebody like Mike Tomlin, they're still catching some fire. And their actions on the field, their frustrations on the field are certainly being brought to the light in recent weeks, George Pickens especially. And it kind of hit a point of emphasis, I would say, when Mike Tomlin opened up on Tuesday saying this, quote, "It's a problem because it's not solution-oriented," he said, talking about George Pickens' outbursts on the sidelines. We're all frustrated, but we have to manage our frustration in a professional and mature way. And when it's not done that way, it's not necessarily pushing towards solutions. Now, everybody from that moment on went, yeah, you're 100% right. You have to be solution oriented. George can't be losing his mind on the sidelines. He can't be making faces. He can't be yelling at coaches. He can't, whatever it is, whatever the cameras constantly catch him doing, and they're obviously constantly going to catch him doing it because he's George Pickens. He's a superstar in the making. Everybody knows it. He's one of the most famous names in the city of Pittsburgh right now. People are going to pay attention to George Pickens during games, and because of that, they're going to catch him doing things that he's not necessarily proud of or would likely do if he knew the cameras were just always pointed at him. That being said, he was asked about the frustrations, and he didn't really hold back. He said, quote, "It ain't really fun losing. I don't really know what reaction you guys would expect if you lose at a video game. If you lose at anything you participate in, you are going to be mad. That's the biggest component of it." Earlier in the conversation, he said, "I just want to win." Pretty simple. And then later, he starts talking about what he could do to win and how he'd like to go about it differently. And he said, "I don't know. You guys be at practice, right? I would just say I hope to see things like that. When it's routes like that, I mean, I can't really produce that way, running 5-yard routes, 3-yard routes." Anybody who saw George Pickens' route tree from their game against New England realizes that he ran like 3 crosses and 1 out. That was about it. That was the entire route tree of George Pickens. And hearing him talk, realizing that he's not going to apologize and sit there, and that's not who George Pickens is. I didn't expect that at all. I mean, you look at George Pickens' track record, and he's not a guy in Pittsburgh, at least. I'm not going beyond Pittsburgh, but since he's arrived in Pittsburgh, he's not going to sit around and apologize for anything. He's just going to tell you how it is, and whether you like that or not is up to you. And in this moment, while I got to say I agree with Mike Tomlin that it's not solution-oriented, I also agree with George Pickens that it is very frustrating to sit around and realize that you are an uber-talented player, that you are probably the most talented offensive weapon that your team has, and you're being underutilized to the absolute max. That in every scenario, the Pittsburgh Steelers are doing everything in their power, seemingly, to take you out of games and hurt themselves. I agree with that. I listened to George Pickens, and while fans are going to be upset and a lot of people are going to be mad and clickbait headlines are going to pop up all over the place about George Pickens just not backing down from his frustrations, his outbursts on the sidelines, I have to say that he's pretty much in the same boat as every other Steelers fan at this point. I mean, do a quick scroll on Twitter, do a quick scroll in a Steelers Facebook group. Go talk to your buddies for 5 minutes at the bar or in a group chat or anything. I mean, you could go through my notifications on Twitter right now, and it will be 15, 16 things about how the Oakland Raiders or the Las Vegas Raiders, smoked the Chargers last night, and how the Pittsburgh Steelers would never be able to do that. That people cannot believe that another team that stinks is showing up and doing great things, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, who shouldn't stink, are unable to do any of it. And then it's a bunch of people who tell me about how bad the Steelers are and how it will never get better. And then sprinkled in there is a couple of people who want to defend Mike Tomlin and this and that. And I agree with everybody, and I'm not calling anybody out. I'm just saying, you want to talk about George Pickens and his frustrations. Imagine being in the thick of it. Imagine being as upset as you are as a Steelers fan, and then having to go out there with the understanding that you are good enough to make a difference on this team and make an impact to this offense, and then realize you're never going to be able to because they're just not going to get you the ball. If George Pickens was a free agent at the end of the season, do you think he'd come back? No chance. Do you think the Pittsburgh Steelers would want him back? 100%. Why? Because it's not his fault that he's upset. It's his fault that he's going about it the way that he is. It's his fault that it's drawing attention. It's his fault that it's making headlines. And it's his fault that Mike Tomlin doesn't believe it's solution-oriented. But it is not his fault that the Pittsburgh Steelers are losing. It is not his fault that the Pittsburgh Steelers are not even seemingly trying to win. And it is not his fault that in the thick of it, well, everybody's mad, including himself, because everybody's mad. Go to a Pittsburgh Steelers game, turn on the television. I'm sure that it's just as loud on the broadcast as it is in real life. The boos are there, and the boo birds have been around all season long, from start to finish, and I don't expect them to go away. And now we're talking about firing Mike Tomlin and starting over and finding a new quarterback and this and that and the third. And I mean, there are a lot of upset people in the Pittsburgh Steelers realm, and George Pickens is one of them, but George Pickens is allowed to be one of them. He shouldn't handle it the way that he does, and he's a wide receiver, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are still somewhat overcoming the trauma of Antonio Brown and what he left them with, and I understand all of that, and that has to be taken into consideration, but I don't know if anybody sat down and told George that, and maybe they should. If Mike Tomlin was going to be real with this guy, if Frisman Jackson, who wasn't around, so I don't even think he should be part of this, but Eddie Faulkner was, I mean, Mike Tomlin was, you sit around, TJ Watt, Cam Hayward were, you sit around, you sit down, you say things. You let them know. You let George Pickens know exactly what Pittsburgh Steelers fans went through with their last wide receiver who had outbursts on the sidelines. Let him know what Steelers fans are dealing with, and maybe he handles those situations differently. But for right now, he's a frustrated 22-year-old who is the most talented player on the offense, who is being utilized way, way less than anybody else on the offense, who's been given less opportunities to make an impact than anybody else on the offense, and who the cameras are always on. That's not a formula for good PR. It's not a formula to look good in these crucial moments that aren't going well. But just remember, yeah, he's probably not handling it in the best way, but it's hard to blame him. And when he's this honest, when he's this open about it, I just have a hard time sitting here and saying, man, George is a serious problem. George is an issue. I can't believe George defended himself being frustrated when the team loses 2 back-to-back games to 2-10 teams. That just doesn't add up to me. I'd be frustrated too. I think anybody in that situation would be frustrated as well. And to sit around and somehow try to say that George defending him being frustrated when he makes a ton of sense in the argument, is a problem, well, then you're not allowed to be frustrated next time you're on the field. And I get it. These guys make millions of dollars. Maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers should remind their offensive play caller that these guys make millions of dollars and that George Pickens is a second-round pick and that he's probably the best player on your offense. Because, yeah, you should remind George that he makes millions of dollars and he should be the perfect example of handling your emotions. I agree with that. But whoever's calling the plays in Pittsburgh, somebody's got to remind him that George Pickens is also the best player that you have available. And maybe, just maybe, everything goes away. But for right now, we'll just talk about George Pickens' frustrations.